Happy birthday, America. It's July the 4th, 2020. What an incredible moment in national history. We've been here before, actually. This is not the first time we have come around this block of standing in need of reclaiming and reaffirming who we are as a people. Our fundamental unity that is around ideals about all humankind created in the image of God and equal. To reaffirm that in our country, which is incredibly unique. I find myself as a person of white privilege at this point in history, in the American experience, conflicted as never before, and yet hopeful as never before. I remember just a couple of years ago or 3 years ago when the first African American on bended knee, can't recall his name, I'm not into sports, sorry about that. Anyway, he went down on bended knee during the anthem, and I remember my own reaction was visceral and angry. I was incensed with rage, and I knew that it was in part ungodly, and I knew that it was in part entirely appropriate. Part of me wanted to just declare it as a righteous rage and hold it still and keep it as one of those foundational things that you believe in and you don't need to reflect upon. But I sensed that was not true, and I asked Jesus for the next week to begin to open my heart and mind. It was about a week later that I was able to release the reality that for this American and for many Americans, he was expressing something that I needed to hear, that I needed to listen to, and he was also clearly well within his rights as an American to protest. That I would have affirmed immediately, no matter my anger. And I remember it took about a week to get there. I kept still on the blogs, didn't want to be the one reacting to it. I listened to the right and to the left and the usual divided story, and was saddened by the framing of it, as I am to this day. Now, just 2 years later, I find that, interestingly enough, in the right circumstances, I may be the one to take the bended knee. But that's because what is unique in this country is the ability to grow, the ability to reflect, the ability to be self-critical. Let's face it, we're an exceptional country in certain ways, and in other ways quite normative. In terms of culture, in terms of our experience, in terms of, we're no greater than Denmark or China or any nation. We're no better or less than these nations and have no right to claim anything. Jack Bauer, you're being really noisy here. Anyway, Jack Bauer's my dog. Sorry about that. But in one respect, I think we can properly and should celebrate the uniqueness of this land. I think it's a God-given thing. And that is that we are a people who are a people centered around not just common experience, certainly not common culture. We are every culture in the world, but a common ideal. What forms us is an idea. That also creates the tension in us, because like all ideals, it is an ever-improving union. It is ever moving towards the end to which the ideal calls us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the core idea. I love that document, and I love the Constitution to which it ultimately became. Common with its Bill of Rights that limits the power of the government in vis-a-vis the individual. Common with the balance of power between the executive and legislative and judicial so that they cannot overlap, so that power cannot rest in these three. Common is that the states actually have sovereignty over such things that are not universally given. And except for where they enter into the rights of humankind, their power is even above the federal power, except in areas where the federal power legitimately is made manifest. And of course, that's grown over the years in terms of our experience. But I love the fact, and a lot of people disagree, that we have an electoral college. It does mean that the President of the United States is not democratically elected in the sense that the person who gets the most votes wins. It means that the person who wins gets the most votes in the most states win. And there's a reason for that. That is true for the Senate, too. The Senate, the House is popularly elected and distributed evenly throughout the United States. But the Senate is 2 representatives per space, per territory, per state, and the president is elected as through the electoral college and thereby elected by the states. That is, he or she must get a majority of votes in a majority of the states. And all of these things in our Constitution are intended as not simply compromises, but ways of keeping us in union, ways of saying that the 4 large cities in the United States, LA, New York, Seattle's not in there, but Chicago and let's say Seattle, where I live, cannot run the country. Otherwise, the president and vice presidency would just stay in 4 or 5 cities in the East Coast and West Coast and hang the rest of the country. It doesn't matter because that's where the votes are. And if you win the most votes there, you become president of the United States. And elections would be very different. As unjust as it is that we start with Iowa and New Hampshire, and we shouldn't. That in my opinion, we should create a system where they start in different states and represent the diversity of the country much better. I have no question that should happen. But I don't ever want us to see a national plebiscite whereby the national advertising controls everything. I love the fact that we have retail politics, that our president actually has to engage real people in real places and real spaces. That's powerful. It's what I believe in this country. It's why I believe in this country. Still, we are far from the ideal. What is obviously true as I listen to my fellow human beings is that my experience, for example, of the police as a young kid growing up white, and those of persons of color are very different. I can bellyache all I want that theirs should be the same as I. It's not. The experience is not the same. The community relationship is not the same. I remember back in the 60s after the riots, and they were much worse than we're experiencing today, and it was horror. It was frightening as a young child, just as people are frightened today. And I remember that President Lyndon Baines Johnson appointed a committee, and then he subsequently rejected the committee's recommendations because they talked in terms of systemic racism. They talked in terms of a nation whose experience of liberty was not the same and was very different according to the color of your race. And the people simply didn't want to hear it at that point. Good morning. And so they rejected, they piled it away. But in that recommendation was a series of prophecies, if you will, and certainly a series of recommendations of what would need to happen if we were going to change things in America. A couple of them had to do with demilitarization of the police, meaning that they were decrying the fact that the police were becoming more and more powerful in terms of armament, quicker to use it, and that neighborhood policing emerging from within the community and feeling very much like they were a part of the community, walking the beats, putting the guns away and bringing them out as you need to, using non-lethal means, de-escalating of issues. They spent a great deal of time talking about the changes that need to happen if this great country were to successfully come to a place of peace and freedom reigning significantly. And we ignored it, we buried it, we put it away. And they says, if you put this away and you bury this presidential review, you will suffer. It'll just continue to happen and be repeated. So 2 or 3 years later, I look and recognize and see the protests in a very different way. I was part of the BLM protest here in West Seattle. I wouldn't have done that 6 years ago because the Black Lives Movement seemed far more less diverse than it is today. It seemed to be coming out of a radical fringe, and I've watched its evolution carefully. And I've watched my own parishioners, intelligent, engaged as Christians of color. I've seen how there's been an evolution in local cities of this movement. And there are some who are Marxists, there are some who are Christian, there are some who are Marxist and Christian, there are some who are Islamic and black nationalists, but all of these various entities or groups are participating inside of this community. Some are committed to anarchy. Those have to be confronted. Those have to be understood as the threat they are, in my view. But it's a different place, and so in the demonstrations we had here in West Seattle, of course, all lives cannot matter ultimately until all lives matter, until black lives matter, and they don't. Not in the same way. That's the common experience. That's what I and we as a nation need to hear, and we need to listen to. So supporting the Black Lives Matter movement is a way of listening. I'm not going to articulate it and go in that area. I'm going to listen, and I need to, because I really am a part of the privileged class. The majority population, it would be true in any country basically. The majority tends to look down on minorities. But we have an issue that goes back hundreds of years. And it has its own history, and I don't need to go into all of that here. It is problematic at best. It is much worse than that, in fact. It's deeper than that. It's our original sin. And sometimes you cannot get rid of those sins unless you face them squarely. The last thing I want to mention is that I just watched last night Lincoln for like the third time, the movie Lincoln by Spielberg. Excellent movie on the 13th Amendment. And then did some reading of the second inaugural address of Lincoln. It's an incredible address. And the power and beauty of it is both in its simplicity and its acknowledgement of what true patriotism is. He basically says in that address, and it's very brief, he basically says, this is not a time for us to reflect on our experience. You've heard me make lots of proclamations, he goes on. He says, this is a time to think universally. So he talks about the fact that the two sides of the country have prayed to the same God, prayed the same prayer, that God would destroy the enemy and ultimately restore victory to their side and peace. And he says, so God has a dilemma. It's a prayer he cannot answer without disappointing one side. And he goes on and says, I cannot promise you that this war it looks like it's going well. It looks like it's going to soon be gone. And by that time it was ramping down. But he says, I cannot promise you the outcome. And he says, if it is the will of God that he take every last treasure, every last drop of blood for all the treasure that was taken from African Americans, that was taken and stolen by the lash, as repayment, as atonement, then so be it. We have to get this scourge behind us in God's view, and we have to pay the price. And then he talks about not judging the South, even so, and about the fact that we all as Americans participated in and received reward from this economic system that was largely located in the South. And so he does the famous words, with malice towards none and charity towards all. We will move into the future, in essence, as good persons see the right. That is the America that I grew up believing in. I wasn't told that often. Too much it's just about pride and ordinances being blown off and celebrations, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it is an America that recognizes there is a creator, that creator gives inalienable rights, that we have never lived into that vision well. And even in Lincoln's address there, he talks about the fact that we need to now live more perfectly into it. It is an America that is proud the fact that it is a unique thing, that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the question is, will it long endure? And the issue, as it was framed by the President Lincoln, was, if we are just in our treatment of ourselves and all of our people, all of our citizens, it will long endure. Black lives matter. They've not mattered. That's the why now we need to frame it and understand it and work towards a better union. May God bless this incredible country. May God bless you on this day of celebration. Celebrate well, celebrate thoughtfully, respectfully, and truthfully. Amen.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
Yes.
It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day
Yes.
this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood.
You were forgiven. The world is forgiven. You were saved. The world is saved. Jesus Christ coming, life, death, passion, resurrection, changed everything. And our call is to open up, to break down the barriers, to open up the gospel so that everyone recognizes they are inside this story.